guess first off, like, how are you all doing? I was thinking about the ways that so much of our access to information is shaped by the way we were raised to perceive information that we read in, nobody has hard copy newspapers anymore, but how we approach the news. And so that's kind of what inspired the topic for tonight, which is going to be the kind of history, a bit of a deep dive into tabloid journalism and when that actually started. Because one, no way! Oh, that sounds delicious! Oh my gosh. Ah, Dunkin' Donuts. I've been there in a minute, but they're really good. Um, Donuts are a really big thing in LA, and I didn't know that before I moved here. And now I have really changed my perception of donuts because I've always loved them, but I think in LA it's like an art form. There's so many donut spaces, like so many, and I don't remember there being that many when I was a kid living not in LA. But it's a whole. Ooh, that sounds delicious. Oh my gosh. Wait, Riley, you and I would get the same thing. I love that. Um, but yeah, so that does sound so good. But um with the kind of onslaught of news that we're getting right now, especially in relation to things like the Epstein files and um, where the country is, I guess you could say temperature check when it comes to like, what? Really? I didn't even know that was an option. Okay, maybe LA is not the only place that is super into donuts. That's wild. I didn't know that was a thing you could do. I think that's so cool. Um, I actually love that. But oh my gosh. Yeah, so like news is something that like, we I think to a degree take for granted because now that we have screens in front of us 24/7, we don't always like we have access to information every single time we look at our phone. And a lot of our Instagram headlines or um what? That, that That's wild. I have never heard of that. Oh my god, is it good? What does that taste like? Ah, mm, okay. I might I might need to travel to where you are, Riley, just to try that out because that's sounds incredible. Oh my god. Um, but okay, so like with the with the reporting, or especially when it comes to like the temperature on how people are feeling about ice, about um, the community response to ice, the legal responses to ice, and also the what is going on with the Epstein files, I have noticed a very interesting difference in how things are reported. On one side, you have people who are using really inflammatory like language, I think to get, to one to get clicks, but two to kind of get people's hopes up when, especially if they are, in the left-leaning, more progressive um, political sphere where it's like, oh, wow, Trump's in so much, like, so stressed because he realizes the whole country is against him now. And he's about to be done. He's done. And the thing is that on the other end, it's almost the same messaging on the most conservative alt-right MAGA end, but it's actually the exact opposite message delivered in the same way. And um, it's interesting because oftentimes when you get to, the extreme of either end of a spectrum, you are exactly the same, where the different messages are being communicated, but the approach to them are the same. And with like deep leftists and more radical leftists, you might be finding that the messaging and the urgency in the way that information is communicated is eerily similar to how it's communicated on something like The Blaze or Fox News or even like Truth Social posts. But what's interesting is even the concept of Twitter and Truth Social and Threads, all of those things were only ever possible because essentially what they are is tabloid media boiled down to nothing but headlines. Because that's what gets the most interaction, is that attention grabbing short sentence that just grabs you by the grabs you by the neck and is like, no, you have to sit here and you have to listen. And that's what actually also encourages people to scroll more, so that you find more kind of dopamine spiking information that is often, rarely I should say, fact checked, but it is engaging. And so I wanted to explore where this all started, and like, where did tabloid journalism start and come from, because it's actually been something that was, to my perception, kind of relegated to those aisles in the grocery store where there's like one or two newspapers that are known for being ridiculous. You know, whatever is in there isn't true, but it sounds exciting. It's like just drama. It's just like reading some messy drama, and it's not true. But because you like right next to a article about some celebrity's scandalous possible affair, which is just a picture of them walking next to another human being. And there's also an article about like, oh, my husband is actually the like a yeti, like, and woman tells all, and it's pretty ridiculous. But the fascinating thing is that I always saw those things as being kind of anchored in the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s. Like Sex and the City had a whole thing about a tabloid newspaper that people would buy, and they knew that it wasn't real, but they also were very engaged in the excitement of these stories about people that they didn't really know, but knew of because they were celebrity figures and maybe also important to the particular area that these people were living in, which was New York in the early 2000s or whatever. But it turns out like there was that always seemed like an area of newspaper reporting, of journalism, that was silly and everybody knew it. But when it comes to like consistent normal news, that was always seen as something very serious, fact checked, and also verifiable. And if it was, it's that kind of that idea of all the news that's fit to print, because you weren't supposed to report on things that weren't accurate. You couldn't cite things if your source wasn't willing to be verified. So even if you had super accurate information, if you didn't have a source that could be backed up by the newspaper that was going to print it, you couldn't print a story, even if you had the evidence in your hands. And that era of news and journalism was something that didn't even start until the mid 50s. I thought it was a lot earlier than that, but it was the mid 50s. And that lasted until the 80s. And obviously, newspapers have been around a lot longer than that. So, how did this work before then? When did investigative journalism start? When did that concept of publishing the truth in an objective manner. Where did that come from? That's very true, Riley. Actually, yes, it's hard to tell. Yes, as you said. Yes, in the 50s. That from like the late 40s, early 50s with Murrow. Ed Murrow, I think is his name. Who was reporting during, it was actually it was like the 50s where it was really mass reporting on a truth focused and objective level became the norm in the 50s, and then really popularized by the 60s with Walter Cronkite, and lasted until the 80s. It wasn't until the 80s that tabloid journalism started to creep its way in and get more of a foothold in the pocketbooks and the mentality of the American public. But long before all of that, newspapers have been around, and the written word has been around for eras, eras and eras. But what was interesting is it used to be that newspapers were a sign of wealth, because the only people who could afford a newspaper were wealthy people. Newspapers used to be quite expensive because you had to have a manual press, which means every single newspaper had to have a person that was pressing it one by one page at a time. They had to set the type, and they had to put all those letters for all the stories backwards. So everything had to be done by hand. So it was really hard to make a mass amount of newspapers. It was something that only wealthy people could afford. And because of that, it also meant that the people who had access to the news were generally wealthier, more educated, and the news was written with the understanding that those people would be the ones taking in the stories, taking in the information. So it was kind of written for them. But years before, like, that was like for quite some time, but there was in the mid to late 1800s, around the 1850s, the New York Times became the first newspaper that was published and syndicated throughout the entire country. But it started in 1850. It started in New York specifically. And that was actually not very long after they created the essentially an industrialized version of the printing press. So instead of it being done by a person, it was done by a machine, and it could produce newspapers so much faster. And because it could do that, it could also actually make it easier for people who didn't have a lot of money to afford newspapers. There were several, and I'll find the sources for this soon, but or cite the sources for this in the when I publish this video. But in the maybe 1860s, 1870s, there became a new essentially market for newspapers, because with the advent of a mechanized printing system, it was a lot cheaper to print newspapers, and so manufacturers could afford to sell them for significantly lower prices. So that's where the concept of a penny paper came from. A newspaper would cost 1 penny, and it would have everything you might want to know about what was going on in that particular area. So it would be the main news, that maybe like there'd be like a world news section, there would be a like local news section, there would be a section for like announcements, like community announcements, like generally marriages, obituaries, and it also became an avenue for people to communicate with each other through something called the classifieds, where people used to actually like they would pay per line, and they would take out these little like tiny couple of sentences, and they would advertise for, if they wanted to sell their house, or if they wanted to, they were looking for love. So it became an entire, quite hilarious, component of newspapers, and that was adopted. It started with the New York Times, but it was adopted by newspapers all over the country and actually all over the world, where people would leave essentially little advertisements for themselves or their personal interests and then they would leave an address for people to write to. So also people weren't as nervous about leaving their address, so they would write their address down for someone to send them mail or communicate with them directly about whatever it was they were looking for. And there was that whole like Lonely Hearts Club. That was a classified section where you could write in and it would be like, hi, my name is whatever, and I am a woman that is this age and looks like this, and these are the things that I like. Basically, it was a Tinder profile or a Hinge profile, but you would put it in the newspaper and you would pay by line for it to be in there. It was generally very short, but it was also a great way for people to communicate with each other and get to know each other in a way that hadn't been accessible before outside of community spaces like churches. So it actually kind of quietly shifted who and how people could get to know each other in their local spaces. But you could even advertise in newspapers that were not in your local spaces if you wanted to reach out to a broader range of people. So classifieds were a really fascinating thing that radically changed how, uh, you know, Americans communicated with each other. But also something was that changed hugely as well is there used to be a kind of a job you could have where you were a newsie, which meant that you or a newsboy. There's generally they would hire like young children, young boys. Oh my gosh, Riley. I don't even like who has like I know you said you have a physical newspaper, but I mean that's so fascinating. Can you think about that? Would be wild. But there there were this group. It was like a full job you could have, especially during the industrial era, which is a period of time that the US was wholeheartedly in. And you had a lot of very, very impoverished people spending all of their life savings to move to the US to escape famine and war in other countries. And, the US was advertising itself as a place to safely change your life, transcend your previous position. And that like just what remember the a few live streams ago we talked about what the inscription on the Statue of Liberty, like that mentality of like give me your poor, you're hungry, everybody, you're homeless, and send them to me and I will take care of them. That mentality was 100% what people wholeheartedly believed about the US. And so scores of immigrants were moving to the US to try and they're handed a better life that was also removed from the traditional caste systems of their home countries. But they're at Dunkin' Donuts? Wow. I didn't even That's wild. That's so cool. Um oh my god. A newspaper and a donut and a whole coffee? That sounds amazing. That sounds amazing. Um But yeah, so you had a huge influx of immigrants moving in from other countries and flocking to the cities because a lot of they were kind of moving throughout the entire country, but they had an easier time connecting to other immigrants in the cities and then choosing to move to different spaces from there. But because of this influx of immigrants and also this like shifting financial power structure that started to develop as the US had essentially aged enough and Reconstruction had affected the country enough after the Civil War, the industrial era was kind of like the US jumping back after, Civil War and an era of like profound poverty for a huge swath of the population because slavery had been the major moneymaker for the country and what had established it as a world power so quickly after its formation. And what? That's so cool, Riley. What? No, I love that. It's only 150. Is there anything in the world that's even at the a dollar store, the cheapest thing is 150? That's amazing. I love that. Um, but yeah, so you have this influx of immigrants, and you have this rising wealth class of wealth, like the Rothschilds and the Vanderbilts, or the yeah, was it Carnegie, J.P. Morgan, um, and gosh, what's his name escaping me? It's so important. Oh my gosh. Okay, well, I will have this all when I have this video put together. But Radcliffe. But anyways, there were a whole new contingent of this group of men who had also, some of them had been immigrants and had worked their way up and technically accomplished the American dream through the use of factories. And it was the beginning in the industrial areas, beginning of and the entire kind of like focus of utilizing and like the influx of immigrants to replace the workers who had been recently freed from enslavement and were no longer free labor for many different companies to use. So it was a way to find cheaper labor for these men who wanted to build financial empires. And so they did. They would create these factories to mass produce, especially because technology was rapidly developing with the creation of the steam engine and also the mechanization of many things that previously had to all be done by hand, like sewing and building, especially larger objects and household objects. All kinds of things were previously impossible, but because of advents in technology, became more assembly line structured and capable to, have people who were not well trained come in and learn how to essentially work in these factories. And in exchange, the the people who owned the factories got very, very rich because they did not pay their workers well. If you worked in a factory in this period of time in the US, and on top of that you were an immigrant, the likelihood was that you were barely making any money at all. Any money at all. So there was a crushing level of poverty going on. And there was intense worker rights abuses. There was no such thing as OSHA. There was no such thing as worker protections, worker comp. There's also no child restrictions on like working ages. So kids as young as 2 or 3 would work with these huge machines, and unfortunately, they would get very badly hurt. And there was nothing to keep them safe. There was definitely a hierarchy, and if you were from Ireland or if you were from a Eastern European country, you were significantly lower on the social caste system that had been established during this era. So all of that is going on. So you have this whole class of people who are moving to the US, trying to learn English, trying to find a way to adapt to the American way of life, and also being worked to the bone and exhausted and broke. And because of all of that, they weren't going to have extra money to spend on anything. But when they introduced the concept of having a newspaper that was only a penny, mind you, like most people made $5 to $12 a week at most, a penny was way more affordable than the like 10 to 12 pennies that the traditional newspaper cost, or more than that. Sometimes it could cost as much as a couple dollars. And a couple dollars at that point, it was probably equivalent to 2 to 3 times, maybe 10 times what it is now. So the price gap in information and the barrier to information started to close. And also because of the things like the classifieds, what people could do is they could start advertising to each other and communicating about their conditions. So workers started to utilize newspapers as a way to share their grievances about how difficult their lives were, how their lives were also completely expendable to their bosses. How, there was things like the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire in Chicago, where an entire factory full of seamstresses the seamstresses were locked in and there was no way out. And when a fire broke out, they were not allowed to leave. Even they tried to leave and they couldn't get out, and almost everybody died. And so that is like it because of newspapers, instead of that being a localized situation where nobody really knew about it and it was able to, other than word of mouth, you know, not really live in public consciousness for long. Instead, it was reported on and it actually ended up in newspapers around the world. So it was able to essentially, due to the mechanization of the printing press, newspaper, and also the reduction in price of newspapers, everything changed. But at the same time, as the price of the papers went down, the headlines that were supposed to engage new customers started to get more and more and more intense. And people got to a point where they would full on lie. They would create stories that had not ever happened. They would take a situation that was radically radically overblow it. So it was a almost like a race to who could create the most intense stories. And these were stories, and these were also, publications that previously had been relatively well regarded when they were primarily focused on selling to the upper class. So instead, it was like, what is the most intense headline that we can come up with that will grab your attention physically on the page? What is going to stop you in your tracks as you're walking down the street? And those newsboys that are running around with stacks of newspapers are, yelling like, extra, extra, read all about it. That's where that comes from. Which headline is actually going to make you stop and buy a newspaper? Because that could absolutely change how many people bought a paper, and it could radically explode the sales amounts for the owners of those papers than some if they were, a little bit more even keeled or even truthful in what they were reporting. So throughout the what's called the Gilded Age, which is the Industrial Revolution era, and the Gilded Age, which also kind of interestingly came a bit to an end because of Theodore Roosevelt. He actually instituted um, checks and balances and anti-monopoly acts on companies that previously hadn't existed, which had allowed many of the most storied families in the US that had gained the most amount of money to essentially have to cap how much they could overtake other businesses. There's a lot to go into there when it comes to the whole antitrust act movement and all of the absolutely wild things that were going on when it came to how people were encouraged to vote. Sometimes there would be thugs that would literally go around and kick their doors in and beat you up to get you to vote for particular candidates, to how people were able to make money, how they were able to outprice businesses that were smaller than them. So all of for example, the I think the family that now runs Walmart used to be, I think they used to have a different. They came from a different industry that was still a a sales industry, and they have historic wealth, and there's different families that are old money. This is where the old money comes from in the U.S. And all of this like kind of overwhelming explosion in excess, in headlines that aren't even true, in you know, rapid growth for the economy comes to a screeching halt because of World War One. And that is also when more mainstream newspapers started to realize that they had to take information, the way they approach the news and information, way more seriously. And it was actually the could be credited with the onset of investigative reporting, because you would have newspaper or news, like you'd have journalists go to the front lines of World War One to report on what was happening so that people back home could know who didn't make it through a battle, what actually happened. And also, they had to be very careful about what they reported, because if they reported the wrong thing, it could lead to disastrous results for the soldiers, because everybody was reading those papers, not just the Americans, but also the enemies. So yes, one cup, you're so right. You're so right. The Onion is a very interesting, like, to me, it is like situationism at its most like obvious. It's really, I think The Onion is a really fascinating exploration of performance art as well. So that's so cool. Um, but the one Onion kind of is also, it harkens more to like the 80s era of tabloid journalism, which we're getting to because it actually has a huge prevalence on how our news media works today, very much because of our president. And I'll get to explaining that in just a second. But what ended up happening was there was this big shakeup in how the news worked. People wanted to know the truth, they didn't want to be entertained anymore. They wanted to truly know what was going on. They wanted to be able to go to the newspaper and learn about what was going on in the world. And a large part of that was also because of the fact that the end of the industrial era and the industrial revolution meant that there were, and also the institution of unions and the pushback against the really flagrant abuse that workers suffered and at the hands of these huge companies in these factories. The pushback against that started to lead to the beginning of a growth of something akin to a middle class in the US. There were, in a lot of the immigrants that had come in during this era had settled and had started to, had families and had, maybe were grandparents by this point, and had been able to establish spaces and communities and like ways to communicate with each other, and were significantly more settled than when they first came here. And so they also started to have access to different kinds of education in the US. It's another component of what Roosevelt did, is he did also encourage education for children up to, I think it was like what would now be like end of elementary school. So he encouraged people, like kids, to go to school, learn to read and write, instead of immediately, almost as soon as they were born, going into the factories. It was a huge change. So suddenly there was a lot more people who were able to participate in written conversation and read and respond and educate themselves further. And the newspapers became a really good way to do that as well. That was an inexpensive way to learn about the world and also essentially grow one's dreams outside of initial survival in your particular space. So the times had changed, and with the onset as well as World War One, and so many people being shipped off to war, and the structure of the economy changing because of it, and of course with the money that was being made by the wealthier elite, due to arms dealing and producing weapons and producing supplies for the armies all over the country, all over the world. War is very profitable for a very small amount of people and devastating for everyone else. And also on top of that, I, there was a reduction in the population because so many people didn't make it home from World War One. And a lot of inventions also were spurned on by the war. Like M&Ms were invented because of World War One, because the soldiers needed something that they could eat quickly in the trenches that wouldn't go bad, because you're in this horrible like tunnel of mud for years ultimately. Um, and when the when the World War One ended, and then there was this brief period of like ecstasy where it was the 1920s, everybody was so excited, and there was this renaissance of the Harlem Renaissance happened. There was so much music and a desire to have shaken off the terror and the horror of being at war and to forget it. There was also a bit of a resurgence of that like kind of intense what became tabloid style journalism. Now, what's interesting is in this era, one thing that was super, super, super influential were cartoons. Because cartoons did not used to be something that was for kids. It was something that was meant to make like a satirization of major political things. So there is the era that I was talking about with that kind of really intense, like Gilded Age, Industrial Revolution era headlines and um, almost like even lying in the newspaper. That was called yellow journalism, which came. I initially was like, not racist, but it came from actually a cartoon of a little boy wearing a big yellow shirt that was like practically like to his leg, like to his ankles. It was oversized for him, and he would on the shirt he had like writing on it that would make fun in a like little quip, a pithy way of some scandal going on, some political, like either it could be about politics, it could be about um, financial issues with the country, it could be about racial issues, it could be about a lot of different things. And they like people would use this style of cartoon to make fun of a lot of other things that normally people would be too scared to poke fun at outside of these cartoons. But because they were done in a cartoon, it was easier to get information through, easier to kind of do that like social check on especially a incomprehensibly like overwhelmingly powerful companies that were at the time running rampant without any checks or balances. Um, so that era kind of ended because of World War One, but during World War, like the between, there kind of popped up again. But by World War Two, it was back to really serious journalism, and there was also the invention of TVs. So I was shocked to find this out. TVs, technically, were available in the 1920s. It's just nobody bought them because they were expensive. And most people didn't really see the point. And, you know, if you wanted to learn about the news, if you wanted to get the latest kind of information or entertainment, you went to the movie theater because it was cheap and it was there. It was like that was just the more normal structure. Home was for not, it wasn't for like, you didn't, home was a space that you ate and you kind of took care of your family and then you left go run errands, or if you wanted to connect with other people, you left home to go do that. So it wasn't as much of this like concept of people staying home all the time. There was a lot more community engagement and interaction because you would go to the movie theaters, you'd go to church, you'd go to the grocery store, you'd go to um, the different like shops that had all the different things that you needed. It was just a very different structure to how your day could work. So you weren't like sitting at home all day, but there also was nothing to sit and watch there. And also, you know, reading and stuff wasn't as accessible because of the like it was a lot. It wasn't as easy to like own books with the amount of money that most people were making. But with World War II, it kind of was like this massive like backhand slap across the consciousness of at least the US, where it really had been used to inflame racist sentiments against Japanese Americans, against anybody that was seen, especially to be used during the Jim Crow era, to encourage racial segregation, division, and full on racism. And but it did also, a really big shift happened where people started to want the truth. After World War One, the end and that brief era of like kind of the tabloidish approach coming back, people were already sick of it. They were like, no, give me the truth. I want to know more. And by this time, a lot more people had been, the structure of a public school system had been normalized throughout the country. And it became more normal to have kids not go work, but go to school. And so you had a wider group of people that were becoming more educated, and you had a wider group of people who were fitting between the ultra wealthy and the ultra poor. So middle class started to form. And with World War II, after World War II especially, it was solidified. But TV was a huge, huge part of it because suddenly people had to see a person and they had to feel emotionally invested in that person to spend time watching them. And as a result, it completely changed reporting. It changed headlines. It changed the way, like, words that could be said, ways people could communicate. There became a different approach of what it looked like to be a serious journalist. And also because of the investigations that people had been doing post World War II, and that the kind of the breakdown of it to find out what was happening and what had happened, especially because of the camps and what was really going on in the Reich and what was really going on with all of the very like wild experiments and cruelties that were being enacted throughout the Reich and throughout the Nazi regime. It changed, I think, it was very sobering for the majority of the US and many people throughout the world. And also, again, in a very short period of time, people went from having World War One, 1920s, the Great Depression, and World War II. So people weren't doing so great. And by the 50s, there was this massive economic boom. And it was also then that you started to see the big shift in ways people reported, because again during World War II you had people who were like, they were listening to the radio really seriously and they were very emotionally attached to the newscasters on the radio. But people wanted to know more. They wanted to uh, connect and have an easier way to connect to other people about the stories they were learning and about what they were finding out. And they wanted to be able to check for themselves. And it really, again, another era kind of set in where from the mid late 40s, especially in the 50s, and then by the 60s when televisions became available throughout the entire country, it actually only further supported this whole approach to journalism, where it was like it needed to be serious, it needed to be super factual, it needed to change, um, it needed to be something that could be respectable. And then Watergate happened with Richard Nixon, and I think it was 19. Watergate happened, which was actually a case of the president paying people to break into the Democrats, um, the Democratic, the offices of multiple key Democratic figures, and stealing information from. Hey, hi Richie, how are you? Hello, hello, hello. Oh, alive on the dresses? Oh yeah, these ones behind me. So they're both Selkie dresses that I got on a sample sale. So yeah, this is ta-da. But yeah. So hi Archie. We're talking about tabloid journalism, and I'm kind of like walking through the whole history of it to get to what is actually close to my point, because I'm almost there, I promise. Sorry, this took forever. But did you? All right. So where to? Okay. So Watergate happened, and Watergate is the reason we have things like Gamergate or or any of that concept of having a gate behind something is like a big like expose or scandal is because of Watergate, and it's because a president paid people to like break in to the key political figures from the Democratic Party and plant evidence and or steal their campaign tactics for the upcoming elections that were going on, and also to steal some other key information. And the reason that was found out was it was story broken by two reporters from the New York Times, which at this point, having been the very first newspaper ever established, was super reputable. Super reputable. To this day, the most reputable newspaper, although I have noticed public perception about the New York Times has been changing. Um, but yes, two reporters broke the story, and it led to the impeachment and resignation of the president because it had been reported in the newspaper. Like, it used to be that if cruelty or wrongdoing was uncovered and published and people could read about it and people knew about it, that was enough to get major political figures to step down. Even though Nixon still had at least, he had several years left in his presidency, he was nowhere close to done. But he was found to have like sponsored to have encouraged this break-in, and was to a theft, ultimately a theft of some documents, of some like campaign secrets, and because of that, he stepped down. But if it wasn't for the very serious approach to reporting that had happened at that period of time, that wouldn't have never happened. Like, I don't even know if we would have known about like Watergate, which was the Watergate Hotel, is where it happened. The hotel where the documents were being kept. And anyways, it was a whole thing. And that used to be enough. But also, right after the end of this, there was also this massive uncovering of sexual abuse scandals that had been reported on by investigative journalists, and the concept of going undercover as a journalist was also like significantly more popularized because of like movies and different types of TV shows and like propaganda media. All of that actually worked really well in the favor of serious investigative journalism. But then the 80s hit. And who came in the 80s? Ronald Reagan. And what did that mean? Deregulation. So, really, really quickly, that completely changed. And you know who took advantage of that the most? Donald Trump. Because in the 80s, he learned that he could actually use the tabloids to lie about how well he was doing. He could purposely feed the tabloids information about who he was having relationships with, dating, who he was hanging out with, which parties he was going to. I mean, he was Kim K before Kim K. And he actively would do that. He would inflame these ideas of like he went right back to the yellow journalism of the Gilded Age. He would pull the same tactics, and he would like plant fake stories about himself, and so would his first wife, Ivana. So they would, yeah, agreed. Agreed. But yeah, the fluff. That makes sense. Um, but yes, so Donald Trump used to give a fake name and then would report, and there's even video, like recorded evidence of these phone calls where he would leave like total lies about how much money he was making on deals that he hadn't actually closed. He would say that he owned things he didn't own. He would say that he was, meeting up with people that he wasn't like, that wouldn't have given him the time of day because he was considered a complete laughingstock in New York high society, even though he was born into ultimate wealth. I mean, it was pretty intense how effectively he utilized the tabloid media and especially paparazzi to sell himself as this, like, the new American rich person, the nouveau riche of the US. And it worked. He became, to middle America especially, a representation of what wealth looked like. There's another reason he used to put his name on a bunch of different random things like steak and hotels and universities to pretend that he was, one, doing significantly better on a business level than he was, and two, because he was able to use tabloid media to prop himself up. And he by far wasn't the first person to do this, but he is certainly an extraordinarily effective person to use. And so at the time, if you weren't really pulled into the tabloid media sphere of the 80s, then you weren't, like, there was still this assumption that the news was factual. That expectation that had been born in the 40s and lasted up until the 80s, which is about 40 years. So that's, a good, let me see, 2 to 3 generations of different people who've been raised with this expectation that the news is honest and that it is investigated correctly and it wouldn't be printed if it wasn't true. Then in the 80s, you start to have like the satanic panic fears, and headlines start to be like creeping back towards extremist idea, like extremist ways of communicating facts, because it starts to sell more. You also have another massive, massive economic boom in the 80s, and a technological explosion in the 80s as well. So it was like this big shift that happened, and so it was almost, and in contrast to what happened in the 50s, where news media got super serious and reporting got super serious, it went the other way. It went into a stage of like 1920s era excess. And then it didn't quite slow down because by the late 80s, early 90s, there started to be a big change in who had access to TV. Because suddenly, by this point, everybody had a TV. Almost everybody had a TV, almost everybody had a color TV, and there was this opportunity to have cable or just like network television, which meant that you could have access to a bunch of different channels. So there was a lot more that was asking for your attention and your time. So whatever and whoever was going to get your attention had to be really like with how they were able to get you. Their titles had to grab you. They had to engage you within the first couple of seconds. And so you start to see this shift in how the news approached, or how journalism was approached, and how, like, especially news channels approached reporting. Fox News started doing 24-hour reporting to capitalize on all the different like markets that had been opened because so many more people had access to a TV and cable than they had before. And not only that, Fox was something that you could get for free, but if their ratings were high enough, it worked very well for them. They would make a lot of money. And so they started doing this 24-hour news cycle. And inherently, yes, a million things happen during the day, but being able to report on it with research and accurately is really, it takes time. You can't just immediately, as soon as you see something, report on it. But the newscasters needed something to say. So they started like sensationalizing media. They started looking towards what would get people engaged the most, and it was the most like overwhelming and least factual approaches to what was really happening. And it was always trying to create the sense of panic because the more freaked out you are, the more likely you are to watch. And that has never that absolutely shaped how media, then of course CNN, MSNBC, all the big legacy media companies had to fight to maintain its popularity, maintain its relevance at the time. So then you see all of these other media companies doing the same thing. So you have all these 24-hour news stations fighting for dominance and trying to get the most intense stories, intense um, headlines to get people to care and to stay and to keep watching and not change the channel, even to stay through a commercial break. Because if you stayed through a commercial break, they would make more money. So it became this big fight. Oh yeah, no, that's a good idea, Riley. Yeah, that's a really good idea. Please don't forget to put that in the Discord so that I don't forget. Um, but yeah, and then that leads the way by the mid 2000s. I think it was about 2005 when the iPhone came out. By 2010, we had like we had we didn't have social media yet, really. No, wait, yes we did. It was MySpace. I forgot about MySpace. Okay, so we like early 2000s, really quickly, with especially with the advent of the internet, then this takes off even more because now you have this like huge access all over the world, where one person can communicate to people from much farther away than they ever could before. But on the other hand, legacy media now needs to try and get the attention of not just the people who are physically in their broadcasting area, but also compete with all of the other world news stations. So they get even more extreme. And this is before social media, this was just the internet. So this, I mean, just radically changes everything. But there's still this assumption that now that you have access to the internet, you can research better. You can do a better job of investigating and reporting accurately. So there's this higher pressure to get accurate media out really quickly. And there's also this pressure to get sensational media out really fast and to constantly have something. So it actually means that, journalists are getting overworked and just sent everywhere 24/7. But then social media steps in, and people stop. It takes a little bit, but people do stop caring as much about legacy media because suddenly you can start to see other people, real people from that space, telling you directly what they're experiencing when they're there. And no. And what's interesting is like when you look at this whole history of tabloid media, how media has, especially journalism has changed. It's always been about getting the most attention possible and finding ways to grab attention from somebody who has no reason to be invested. But at the same time, it's also allowed people, like with the classifieds, to connect who never could have before. And it paved the way for social media because it allowed people to communicate with each other from across the country, from across the world. And as Donald Trump famously explored, he also, you could argue, was the first. He was Jake Paul before Jake Paul. He was Logan Paul before Logan Paul. He used uh, essentially that era's social media to shape a narrative about himself. And you could do that if you had the right money, the right connections, and the knew who to call, essentially. And it's kind of wild how, especially with we have access to things like Twitter, Trump really jumped onto Twitter and has used that to report on, and create his narrative about what is going on in his perception of what he wants the public to think. And it's interesting is because of this pressure for there to be, in the real estate of our minds, we don't have as much space to focus on the people who are quiet. We go towards whoever's shouting. So, for anybody who's trying to provide an alternative viewpoint to what's being propagated, either by legacy media or by, the alt-right, they also have to shout. So now you get like progressives who are also and leftists who are also using inflammatory language in order to get your attention. It's pretty nuts. Like, if you look at where we are right now, I think you could argue pretty easily we haven't changed that much from the Gilded Age. You could almost say that we've gone a little bit in a circle. So, I. Oh, okay. I think. Wow, cool. Okay. I think I may have kind of gotten to the end of my spiel for tonight, but I really appreciate you all jumping in. So thank you so much. Also, I think I figured out some of the things that I'm going to be fixing for my next stream. But I will, Riley, don't forget to put in the Discord the topic that you are thinking about with the how screens and change the shape of our brains and how that affects us. That would be a very fascinating topic to look into. So I will definitely do some exploration for that. When it comes to when this video is going to be dropping, it's probably going to be, let's see, today, obviously today is as a test stream, so it's an experiment, but also very different from what my normal schedule is going to be. So I will see how editing on this goes, but regardless, I will try and have all of these things fixed up so that by Sunday I can back for another. And then it will be on Sundays I'll be doing here, and then on Tuesdays I'll be on. So those can be a little bit more silly, I think. And I'll also try and keep an update on when videos will be dropping, or once I've got them all edited and all of my sources put together to kind of have involved and integrated into the video and everything. So, all right. Thank you, everybody. I appreciate you all so much for being here and for your patience this week as I've gotten this all figured out. But yeah, I will hopefully see you all again Sunday here and on Tuesday on Instagram. So, all right. Thank you. Have a good night.